His was the only boat to arrive.
I think maybe it was a cow. I don't know.
There's the thank you letter from Lyndon Johnson.
There was even a monorail at one point to the east of us.
Plus, everybody forgets about pirates.
This is the coolest field trip I have ever been on.
I don't know, but I've been told, keep on dancing, won't ever get old.
Hello, and welcome to the Long Island History Project, the podcast that brings you stories and interviews with people passionate about Long Island history. You can hear them all at longislandhistoryproject.org. My name is Chris Kretz. I am your host, and our opening music is courtesy of the Homegrown String Band. Today we are heading out to Brentwood in Suffolk County, a place that has gone by a few names in its history and has been the site of many fascinating stories, including the story of the very special man we are talking about today, as told to me by our two very special guests.
Hi, my name is Ellen Edelstein. I am the president of the Brentwood Historical and a longtime Brentwood resident.
My name is Peter Ward, and I am a librarian at the Brentwood Public Library.
Okay, first of all, thank you both for sitting down. We are in the Brentwood Public Library in the local history room, talking about a part of history that crosses through Brentwood. I guess we can say we'll discuss more, but the man of the hour is Raymond Buckland. And Peter, do you want to start us off? Talk a little bit about the history of the man and the history of him that you've collected. You know, was he known to the library here?
Oh, sure. Well, I was researching a little bit about Brentwood history, and at first I was surprised to learn about him because Raymond Buckland was the person who brought Wicca to the United States, and I didn't know all that much about him, and I was surprised to learn that he actually lived in Brentwood and founded our version of that religion in the 1970s, right here in Brentwood. But the more I looked into it, I found that we actually had some items relating to Buckland and his life in Brentwood right here in our local history collection. And it was so interesting because this is such a, I guess, growing and big religion that a lot of people know about today, but nobody really remembered him or his story in Brentwood. And I felt like it would almost be like if you had Moses living next door and you were Jewish or something like that. You knew about the Ten Commandments or you knew about the Bible, but you didn't know, oh, Moses lived in the house down the street.
You remember that neighbor who used to part the sea? Yeah, right. Well, and so I've only done a crash course in his history, but we'll just say to set the tone, he was born in 1934. He was English. He was actually, his father was a Romani, which is interesting. So he was half Romani, but he moved here in 1962. Worked for British Airways. So, Ellen, we were going to bring you in on this because you came to Brentwood in a similar time frame. Do you want to just talk about what you remember of your early days of Brentwood? Just kind of set.
Sure. My family moved to Brentwood in 1967, late 1967. I commuted back to Jamaica to finish high school, but we moved here because my father had a men's clothing store, which is still in existence, and I used to work there on weekends. So Ray Buckland had at least one son, probably more. I think he had two.
Sons, yep.
Yeah, I think he had two.
And they were teenagers.
And they were teenagers. They used to come in and shop in the store. Now, he was a very, with his British accent, he was a very interesting looking man, with his Van Dyke beard and very polite, very nice man, but he used to drive a hearse. So when he'd pull up to the store, the first thing you notice is the hearse parked out front, and he'd come in, and I didn't have a whole lot of idea who he was at that point, but talking to my friends, they'd say, oh, he's the witch that lives on Timberline. And that's how I found out who he was. It was not something we ever discussed at that time because, wanting to be respectful and not having all that much time to spend. He came in to shop, and I was working. But we used to go by the house on Halloween, as did most of the neighborhood, and it was always well decorated, although he was not a fan of Halloween, and that was not his thing. But people used to go because it was the witch on Timberline, and it was Halloween.
So it was a known,
it was known, yeah. The community knew, and his sons went to the high school. Mm-hmm. Now, fast forward a couple of years, and I started to teach in the high school. And at some point, many years down the road, I became interested in Brentwood history. Reinstituted the Brentwood Historical Society, and I think Peter probably mentioned his research on Ray Buckland. I said, I knew him, and let me see what I can find out. And I was able to track him down in Ohio. We had several conversations on the telephone, and I was hoping that he would come and do a presentation. Unfortunately, he was very busy and promised to send me a video that I could use. And it never came to pass because he passed away before this actually happened.
Okay, and we should say he died in 2017. So he's actually It's intriguing to think he could have come back and we could have been recording something with him today.
Yeah, absolutely, absolutely. I'd been in touch with his wife several times. Our communications began in 2014, and we went back and forth. I just looked up my emails. Going back and forth with him. And they began in 2014. He said, I'll get you something. I'm working on it. Check out my videos on YouTube, things like that, which of course I did. And he promised me a DVD. And then in 2017, I sent an email and said, Ray, I haven't heard from you for a while. Are we still on? And unfortunately found out that we were not any longer.
So just to stick on that for a minute, then we'll go back in time. But so when you were speaking with him, and I don't know if this came out, but was he still? Were you talking about Wicca with him, or was
Absolutely.
It more, okay.
I wanted him to give his perception of Brentwood at the time, how Wicca developed, because he had the museum in Bayshore. He was married more than once, and so when he was in Brentwood, he was with his first wife. By the time he got to Ohio and I reconnected with him, he was on second wife. So
it might have even been the third, I think.
I'm not really sure. Yeah, there may have been. I mean, we didn't get into the personal,
sure.
the personal stuff, but so he had kind of put Brentwood behind him at that point, but he was still involved in Wicca and promulgating the religion and such.
I should mention, too, though, the man who currently runs the museum, with all of the Buckland Museum, with all of Ray's things, I was speaking to him, and he said he wants to visit the library to speak to us, so that'll be interesting.
Oh, that's great. Yeah, so let's talk about the museum, maybe. So was it the Buckland Museum of Witchcraft and Magic? Is that the official?
Oh, yes.
we have a flyer here from. So what evidence do you have, Pete, in the library or in your files? We're looking at a flyer of it, so we know there's one thing. And Ellen, you mentioned Bayshore, but when I've read, it actually started in the basement of that Timberline house.
Yeah, we have in the library a flyer advertising the Museum of Witchcraft and Magic from when it was in its Bayshore location, but originally it was in Brentwood. And the interesting thing is, before he even started advertising a museum, he did a few displays of his witchcraft artifacts and writings at the library. So he did library displays first, and then he started having a little museum in the basement of his house in Brentwood where people could come and take a look at the artifacts. And finally, it became so popular that they had a whole building in Bayshore. And this is the advertisement we have for the Bayshore Museum, where it says adults $1, children 50 cents, and groups by appointment. And it was open from 10 to 6, except on Wednesday when it was closed. But
what kind of artifacts did he have in there? And we'll point people to the existing collection now, but I know he had some voodoo dolls. Like, he had collected things from different activities throughout his time.
One of the things he had was a horned helmet, and in one of the Newsday articles, he's shown holding the helmet. What are some of the other things? I think knives,
or I know, and it's funny. One of the articles mentions he sells crystal balls. That's one of their best sellers. Like in the gift shop, he had come up with a line of crystal balls, but also artifacts. I think some witchcraft related, like historical artifacts about witchcraft in the States and in England.
I have to see what other ones. Maybe that library article mentions some of them.
Are there pictures of the displays from that time, or is that?
No, we just have a clipping from an article about the display. What other things were there in the display?
Is that museum still open?
Well, the collection was in storage for a long time, and a couple of years ago they reopened it in Ohio.
Yeah, so it is a going concern now, and it's sort of, but it sounds like they're aware of that legacy of Buckland's collection moving as he moved, and it.
Yeah, when I spoke to him, I asked about what records he had about the different locations of the museum, and he confirmed the address in Brentwood. So he has Buckland's notes and some of his writings and things like that, and he has the different records of the museum.
So, and maybe we'll, at some point I'll go to Bayshore and talk to them, but from what I've read, he moved it was sort of a Victorian mansion in Bayshore, even a spookier house probably than the Timberline. So, I mean, it sounds like, and Ellen, you mentioned the hearse, it sounds like at some point he leaned into at least some of the popular aspects of his reputation.
Remember that this was the 60s, 70s, hippies and such. His wife at the time, very long hair, feather earrings, things like that, extreme jewelry. He wore a lot of jewelry, as I recall, like turquoise and things. So he was flamboyant in his way, but in those days that wasn't that unusual.
Right.
So he did embrace his culture, who he was, but he didn't we have a lot of colorful characters in Brentwood, so Ray Buckland was just one of many.
Well, and I was going to ask both of you then. So, and the 60s into the 70s, and Peter will do another episode on the deeper history of the planned, the utopian communities out here. But
spiritualism.
Yes. Well, so there is sort of a vibe in Brentwood, would you say, or
absolutely
did it attract?
Brentwood has always been a community of diversity, and whatever diversity means at any given time, you can find it in Brentwood. So if diversity meant hippies and veterans and soldiers and you name it, everybody was welcome in Brentwood, and everybody found their way to Brentwood. It tended to be a relatively inexpensive place to get started. It was considered a starter community for many people with their first houses and such. So, and then there was also the closing of Pilgrim State Hospital, which introduced a whole nother facet of population to Brentwood. Because
so former residents
at Pilgrim State, it probably was not handled as well as it could have been handled, because many of these people just found themselves on the street or without proper guidance. So there were always people who were unusual.
Well, and it's interesting because another through line through Ray's life, he was a constant writer. He's was one of his passions. And one of the articles, and we'll list to these on the site, but mentions him writing on his way into the city on the Long Island Railroad. He worked for British Airways for a long time. So it's finding an affordable house in Long Island and commuting to the city is also a familiar story. So it's interesting to think of him going in and writing these. So Peter, you've got the files and probably studied him more than I have, at least. What can you say about what he was founding in terms of, he's called, I think, the father of American witchcraft or Wicca. How much do you know? I'm not an expert myself, so what have you read about what that movement was that he introduced?
Oh, well, one thing that's interesting, we were talking about some of the artifacts, and I found another picture here of another one of the horned helmets that was in the collection, and he was basing it on some writings about the history of a real or imagined witch cult in Europe, and it was believed that they worshipped what they called a horned god, so that is one aspect. And more directly, though, he was inspired by Gerald Gardner, who had reinstituted witchcraft in England, and he based his ideas on things like theosophy and Aleister Crowley's work and things like that, and sort of reimagining the history of witchcraft. And one thing that's interesting about the influence, too, is Ellen was talking about Buckland's rather distinctive look, and if you look at pictures of Gerald Gardner, it seems like he even sort of was inspired by his look from Gerald Gardner.
Big flowing hair, and the jewelry, yeah.
So he started that Gardnerian tradition. He continued it in America, and it had only been started a few years before Buckland started the American branch. And then after that, as a writer, he started popularizing this Wicca and witchcraft, and even writing his new interpretations of the religion.
Yeah, and what's interesting, we're talking about him sort of leaning into it. If you go online, you can. He was very active in promoting it in terms of newspaper interviews, online. He was on the Dick Cavett show. He was on a lot. He did a lot of television appearances, all while he was still in Brentwood, right? So this is when he was. So I don't know if there's anything you want to say to that in terms of how visible he became. And I think initially he kind of did not want his neighbors to know that he was a witch, or there was some secrecy behind it until.
Well, that was very interesting, because initially one of the practices of witchcraft was that you weren't supposed to promote it, and it was supposed to be a secret ritual. And then once he was sort of outed and these articles started being written about him, he really leaned in and went so far as leaning into people's perceptions and imagination about witches. And I think that's why he had the hearse and the appearance that he did. And one thing I found really interesting is that when he went around promoting witchcraft is, like you said, how accepted he was by people. And there's even reports of, I like this. He spoke at the, one place was the Adelphi Historical Society, but then he spoke to groups of students and schools and things like that. But the one I really liked was he spoke at the Republican Club. So he was a controversial figure, and he was a witch. He also spoke at the Republican Club about witchcraft.
And some of the stories written in the day are, the reporters lean into the stereotypes, so that they start off talking about broomsticks and their own perceptions. But so he did found a coven, and again, I don't know all the ins and outs of the structure that he introduced, but there was I don't know if it was a Brentwood coven or a Bayshore coven, but in terms of the structure that he introduced, there was a group of witches. And I think they trace the lineages of these as they get founded in different parts of the country. So I think the Brentwood coven or the Bayshore coven is known as one of the first in the country.
Yeah, so he started the coven in Brentwood, and that was one of the first one in the United States. And I guess this is a controversial aspect of it. So he has a video on YouTube that he made in the 70s about witchcraft, and it was filmed in Brentwood, the different rituals and things like that. And there were scenes that were at his house in Brentwood. And then the other thing, the controversial thing that some of the newspaper articles mentioned, is that a lot of the coven rituals were performed sky-clad, which meant in the nude.
Well, it was the 60s or 70s.
Yeah, that part wasn't on the video.
Right. Well, and the other thing, we're talking about the things that the history room here has, and you were showing me this before, but maybe you can explain it a little better. It looks like loose leaf pages in a binder with a pentacle on the front. But do you want to explain sort of what you know about this artifact and what it is?
Oh, sure. So in the history room, we have a collection of articles about Buckland and his time in Brentwood. And in the 70s, when people wrote about witchcraft, he's mentioned in newspaper articles and academic articles as well. And we also have this handwritten booklet, and on the front there's a pinnacle, and it says witch name in the middle, so you could fill it out, and it's called a workbook. And in the book, we have a number of different, basically, rituals and spells handwritten in ballpoint pen. We have drawing down the moon, which is one of the famous witchcraft spells, and an introduction to witchcraft. Another is called conjuration to Diana, an oath, and the fivefold kiss. And if you look into witchcraft, these are some of the notable rituals we have. But then we have some other writing that shows that these were the notes for a later branch of witchcraft that Buckland was working to develop.
Okay. So and it's interesting, again, I don't know the history enough, but we mentioned Gardner, and then, the Gardnerian Wicca, and then we know that we were talking before to find out the pronunciation, but Buckland introduced a strand called either Seax or Seax Wicca. So it's interesting that it evolves, and it's almost like Protestantism. You can kind of see it following the paths of other religions as they fine-tune it or adapt it. So this document that you're looking at, do you know the date of it? Is there any evidence of that?
No, unfortunately, there isn't much in terms of bibliography about the document, but we do see some hints about when it may have been written. So we see a list of runes that are drawn in the document, and then it talks about incorporating Odin and the Norse gods into the religion, which were sort of the innovations that Buckland would make in creating this Saxon branch of Wicca.
Have you ever had researchers come look at this, or do you know that is it cataloged that people would know to come see this? Or it's a fascinating document. I'm just looking at it as you're flipping through.
No, I only saw it fairly recently because I was looking at some of the other items that we had about witchcraft, and this particular folder had ended up in a box of some other material. So I was looking through all these other boxes for another research project, and the stuff of Buckland's manuscript and some of his other items had ended up in another part of the library.
Okay.
So
there's always one of the dangers of archival research. Exactly, the misfiling Well, now you have it again, though. That's great.
And this folder was put together by a Martha Stepsis. Wow. So
that's going back. Okay.
She was the librarian at the time Buckland was in Brentwood.
Yeah. So I don't know if you want to grab that back. So Ellen, and we touched on this, but so in your mind, I think he left. When did he move? In the 84. I'm just looking at my notes. So he left Brentwood at some point, and you talked to him, and like you said, he moved on. In terms of people in Brentwood, how long? When did people stop remembering the house on Timberline, the witch guy, and the hearse?
It really is hard to say because I wasn't involved at that point. Community-wise, it's not my neighborhood. And
where is, so if you envision...
Well, Timberline is East Brentwood. It's down off 2nd Avenue. It's not in the modern time section of town, which is where we're sitting now. The library's located in what was the original modern time section of Brentwood. Timberline Drive is one of the Robin Hill developments, which is east of here, probably a mile or two. Nothing's terribly far away, but different neighborhoods, different shopping areas, and so at that point in the 80s when Ray would have been moving, I was involved in a career. I wasn't really talking to neighborhood people in that regard, so I don't know when they stopped or, how quickly the neighborhood changed. Houses tend to go up in groups.
Right. Well, and then it kind of leads me to think, does the current occupant of that house know the history?
I don't know that they really know, to be honest. I would be surprised if they knew.
Well, I was going to throw it back to Peter then. So in terms of Brentwood, the community and the history, what would you like the community? I mean, we're talking about it, but where would you like Buckland to be remembered by the history? Do you think there should be a plaque to him, or more awareness of him, or?
Ooh, that's interesting. Well, can I say something about the house first? Sure. I wonder if the person who lives there does know about him, because when I was talking to the person who runs the museum, he was mentioning that he tried to look at the house from Google Maps before, but it's blocked out. Like the person who lives there doesn't want people looking at it. So really? I wonder if
like
something about
or there's a spell of protection on it.
Maybe that's it. But I think maybe a plaque would be a good idea. I think he should definitely be remembered, and he definitely is a very important. And I think people, when I've mentioned him to like teenagers who come into the history room and are interested, they're very interested to learn that he was a part of Brentwood history. And he even continues the earliest traditions of Brentwood history, because when we were talking about Brentwood being open to all sorts of people, in the earliest days, it was known as being a hub of spiritualism. And when one of the first people in Brentwood put up a tent for church worship, they mentioned that everybody here is spiritualists, but they still come to the services to see what's going on anyway. And one person even wrote about Long Island in a newspaper article and said 1/3 of the inhabitants of Long Island are spiritualists. And that's how Ray Buckland became interested in witchcraft. His uncle had been a spiritualist
Back in
and
England,
he started
yeah.
researching. So,
Which is interesting then, I guess we'll never know, but did he somehow hear of Brentwood and that connection and that drew him out here? Or?
It's quite possible because one of the original settlers, Henry Edger, came from Brentwood or Burntwood, England. So there is definitely an English
Even the name
connection
itself, yeah.
to Brentwood. After it was Modern Times, it changed its name. Modern Times had developed a somewhat negative reputation after, around the time of the Civil War. So they decided to change the name, and Brentwood was chosen because Henry Edger had come from Brentwood, England. Now, I don't know where Ray's uncle, what part of England Ray's uncle came from, but it's quite possible that there was a connection there, and that's what cued him into Brentwood, New York.
So any final thoughts? Is there anything you guys we haven't talked about, or anything from the files that maybe you think is of interest about Ray? Or
I found another item listed. Another item listed in the file from the museum was a sword, and it says the sword was used to draw the circle in which the rituals were performed.
Okay. Yeah, and he again, just to say that he wrote extensively. He's got a lot of books on witchcraft, obviously, but also he wrote under pen names. That was again another passion of his. He was always writing, and as he moved eventually to California, and he was involved in Hollywood in a sense. There's a great, if you can find the trailer online, but there's an Orson Welles movie from 1972 called one of its names is The Witching, and somehow Ray was like an advisor on that for the consultant. Again, not being too versed in this, but from all I've read and seen of him, it was, and I don't want to use the word benign, but it was not witchcraft in the sense of evil. And just in terms of the religion that he was founding, it was very life positive, I would say. Yeah.
And a lot of the modern revival of witchcraft, even though it had connections to, at the beginning, some characters who are connected to controversy, witchcraft itself was sort of Buckland, the way he was writing with this Saxon witchcraft, was seen as a revival of earlier religions and mythology, like relating to what the Norse religion must have been or the Saxon religion. And so they saw it more of an early religion rather than casting spells and things like that in the way we think of it.
Well, I think your suggestion of memorializing Ray in some form in Brentwood, I think, is a very worthwhile thing for us to consider. I don't know how exactly we could go about it or where exactly we should go about it, but I definitely think that even if it's a periodic display of history involving Ray Buckland would be an important thing to do. He was a nice man. He was a good man. And I'm sorry we don't have more information or more direct information about him, that he didn't have the time to revisit us.
I'll ask you one last question just as a teaser that I'll put in. But so we've been talking a lot, and you're both so heavily invested in Brentwood history. So do each of you just want to tell me what is one other story of Brentwood history that we're not going to dive into it, but that you would say would be worth people knowing about? Like what's on your radar that is like another hidden Brentwood story that you want to get out there at some point?
Oh, well, I have a good one from those early days that's connected to Ray. I forgot to mention this, but one of the early spiritualists was named Minnie Merton. And she's mentioned in a few books about spiritualism that people were writing at the time. And one of the things that she's known to have talked about doing was seeing different colors around people. And she could tell their personality by the different colors she saw. And that's a lot of people today are interested in auras and things like that. So that's 1870. And she was talking about that back then. And Ray and later people in the New Age movement were all very interested in that too.
I think another hidden gem of Brentwood that people may not know about now is Knoll Farm, the horse farm that's on Suffolk Avenue that is unfortunately being slated for housing with only a small portion of it being retained as a horse farm. But back in the day, we used to have major horse shows, somewhat like the Southampton Classic. And the Kennedys rode at Knoll Farm. I remember sitting on the fence on Suffolk Avenue watching the horse farm, watching the horse shows. And I don't think a lot of the current residents of Brentwood know how strong the history of Knoll Farm or how important the history of Knoll Farm is. And that's something that we probably should pursue.
And thank you again to Peter and to Ellen for helping us bring to light the history of Raymond Buckland and his time in Brentwood. You can find links to a lot of the resources we were talking about, including some pictures and ways to get in touch with the Brentwood Public Library and the Brentwood Historical Society. We will list those all at longislandhistoryproject.org. If you have your own story to tell or you know some things about what we've been discussing, please drop us a line. You can get us at longislandhistoryproject@gmail.com. Always happy to add to what we've learned and share that with others. This is the first episode of the new year for us, so if you are a return listener, thank you for sticking with us. If you are a new listener, welcome. All we ask is that you share us with a friend, whether you're on island or off, whether you've moved away or moved back. Help us spread the word that there is a podcast out there dedicated to Long Island history. Our outro music is Capering by the Blue Dot Sessions, used under an Attribution 4.0 international license. So a belated Happy New Year to everybody. That does it for this episode, and as always, thank you for listening.